Canada strengthening its bond with China. Is this inevitable? Should we pull up a chair with China, maple syrup for microchips, and pretend we don't miss Uncle Sam's barbecue?
Why Canada looks more like an ally to China than to the United States? We don't understand.
Now our former allies like Canada are cutting deals with China, and China's importing record amounts of Canadian oil after cutting U.S. purchases. So, everyone else in the world is trading with each other, but us will be, sitting on the sidelines. No big deal.
China wants Canada's help to strike back at America, but there will not so such thing as partnership. Just the price American and Canadian must pay. In 2025, China made Canada an offer, more trade, more investment, a way to escape US pressure. Canada, accepting Beijing's hand, could ease the pain of Washington's tariffs, but it could also trigger a new wave of consequences. It's a reminder that in today's geopolitical game, even offers of cooperation can trap a nation in a conflict it never wanted. But here's the twist. China's offer wasn't a lifeline. It was a calculated move in a much bigger game. While Washington uses tariffs to enforce loyalty, Beijing uses opportunity to demand it. And the real question is, how long can Canada navigate between US demands and China's offers before neutrality turns into vulnerability? To understand why Canada is trapped today between two superpowers, you have to rewind, not to recent months, but back to 2018. It was in Trump's first term that Canada's position on the global stage quietly, but irreversibly, shifted. That year, under the banner of America First, Trump made a decision that stunned Ottawa. He imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. For the first time in modern history, the United States, Canada's closest ally, largest trading partner, and long-standing neighbor, treated Canada as an economic threat. Although these tariffs were eventually lifted in 2019 after intense negotiations, the damage wasn't undone. Trump had rewritten the rules. Alliances no longer protected you from American economic aggression. But Canada's real descent into geopolitical vulnerability didn't end with Washington. In December 2018, another decision, this time framed as a routine legal obligation, would drag Canada deeper into a conflict it never wanted. At the request of the United States, Canada arrested Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou while she transited through Vancouver. Ottawa viewed this as simply upholding international law, maintaining its image as a rules-based nation. Beijing, however, saw it very differently. The response from Beijing was swift and unforgiving. China slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian canola and pork, suspended beef imports, and froze diplomatic relations. Canadian exporters, farmers, and businesses suddenly found themselves paying the price for a geopolitical rivalry they had no control over. While Canada faced Beijing's retaliation alone, the United States, the very country whose request had triggered this crisis, offered no real support. There were no trade concessions, no protective measures, no diplomatic shields. Economically, it was heavily dependent on US markets, with over 75% of its exports flowing south of the border. Politically, its attempts to diversify trade through engagement with China had now backfired, revealing that access to Beijing's markets came with hidden costs, namely compliance and political alignment. Canada was trapped between two competing giants, each willing to use economic pressure as a weapon. Fast forward to 2025, and Canada isn't facing a new crisis, it's reliving the consequences of a strategy set in motion 7 years earlier. Trump, returning to office, didn't need to invent new tactics. He revived the same playbook from his first term, this time targeting Canadian natural gas with a 10% tariff and using accusations about Chinese fentanyl trafficking through Canada as justification for further trade pressure. Meanwhile, China, recalling how effectively it had coerced Canada in 2019, extended a so-called partnership offer, urging Ottawa to join forces against American bullying. But Canada knew better. Today's challenges aren't about individual policies from Trump or one-off gestures from Beijing. They're the product of a system where Canada was redefined, not as an independent actor, but as leverage in a larger geopolitical confrontation. Canada isn't standing at a crossroads in 2025. It's trapped in a cycle that began the moment Trump blurred the lines between ally and adversary, and when China proved that trade relationships could be weaponized overnight. For both Washington and Beijing, commerce has evolved into something far more strategic, a silent battlefield where tariffs replace treaties and market access is granted or revoked based on loyalty, not mutual benefit. Trump understood this dynamic better than most. His approach wasn't merely protectionist, it was transactional dominance. For him, Canada's deep economic ties to the US weren't a sign of partnership. They were a vulnerability to exploit. The 10% tariff on Canadian natural gas in 2025 wasn't about energy security or fair competition. It was a calculated move to remind Ottawa who dictated the rules in North America. Every percentage point in tariffs was leverage designed to squeeze concessions, force alignment on anti-China policies, and ensure that Canada never dared to act independently on the global stage. At the same time, Beijing played a parallel game. China didn't need to threaten Canada openly. Its strategy was subtler but equally coercive. After years of retaliatory tariffs on Canadian agriculture, Beijing shifted tactics, offering partnership, investment, and expanded trade, but only if Ottawa distanced itself from Washington's orbit. The brutal truth is that both superpowers are using the same playbook, just with different branding. The US uses punishment to enforce loyalty. China uses incentives to achieve the same goal. Canada's critical sectors, energy, agriculture, technology, are now bargaining chips in negotiations where Ottawa isn't even seated at the main table. This is not a temporary crisis. It's a systemic shift where global powers no longer view trade as a mutual exchange, but as a tool to redraw spheres of influence. What makes this situation even more precarious is that Canada's internal politics offer no escape. Whether under Mark Carney's pragmatic leadership or Pierre Poilievre's hardline stance, the reality remains unchanged. Neither leader can shield Canada from being positioned as leverage in this global power struggle. Carney's push for trade diversification is undermined by structural dependencies. Poilievre's alignment with US policies risks further alienation from alternative markets. In essence, Canada is no longer negotiating trade agreements. It's negotiating its survival in a geopolitical environment where trade has become the most effective form of warfare. The country's industries, workers, and economic future are now subject to decisions made in Washington and Beijing, far beyond Ottawa's control. It's easy to believe that elections, new leadership, or shifting political rhetoric could offer Canada a way out of this geopolitical trap. But that's a comforting illusion. Whether it's Mark Carney's calculated pragmatism or Pierre Poilievre's aggressive posturing, neither leader holds the power to alter the fundamental dynamics at play. Mark Carney presents himself as the voice of reason, a leader who understands global finance and advocates for diversifying Canada's trade relationships. On paper, his vision seems logical: reduce dependence on the US, seek opportunities in emerging markets, and engage China cautiously through sectors like clean energy and sustainable finance. On the other side of the political spectrum, Pierre Poilievre offers a tougher stance, mirroring Washington's hostility toward Beijing. He champions tariffs on Chinese goods, supports restrictions on Chinese investments, and frames Canada's future within the context of a fortified Western alliance against authoritarian influence. But Poilievre's rhetoric ignores a dangerous truth. Aligning too closely with the US doesn't shield Canada from economic harm. It invites it. Trump has proven repeatedly that loyalty offers no protection when America's interests come first. Under Poilievre, Canada risks becoming even more entangled in US strategic objectives. sacrificing what little trade independence it still holds. In reality, both leaders, despite their contrasting strategies, are reacting to a game whose rules were set long before they took office. Today, trade is dictated by power, not policy. Nations are expected to demonstrate loyalty through economic choices: who they trade with, whose technology they adopt, whose sanctions they enforce. Canada's dilemma is further compounded by public sentiment. Every decision, whether to impose tariffs, accept investments, or participate in international coalitions, is scrutinized by both superpowers for signs of disloyalty. What's most alarming is that this isn't a short-term geopolitical storm. It's the new global framework. Neither Carney's diplomacy nor Poilievre's defiance can reverse that. In the end, Canada's survival won't depend on choosing the right leader. It will depend on whether the nation can withstand being treated as leverage in a game where it was never meant to win, only to comply. At this point, it's no longer a debate about trade policy or diplomatic strategy. The real question Canada faces is far more existential. In a world where economic loyalty is enforced, not negotiated, does a country like Canada even have the right to choose its path anymore? For decades, Canada thrived under the belief that it could engage globally without being forced into binary alliances. But today, that belief is collapsing under the weight of geopolitical reality. The United States no longer views Canada as a sovereign partner, it sees it as a strategic extension of American policy. Every Canadian decision is expected to align with US interests, especially when it comes to isolating China. Trump's tariffs aren't just economic measures. They are warnings. They send a clear message. Deviate from Washington's agenda, and you will pay. Trapped between two powers that refuse to accept middle ground. Forced to navigate a geopolitical landscape where every trade deal, every tariff, every diplomatic gesture is scrutinized for signs of allegiance. The deeper question isn't which side should Canada choose, because both choices come with unacceptable costs. Align fully with the US, and Canada becomes economically dependent, politically subordinate, and perpetually vulnerable to the whims of American protectionism. Move closer to China, and Canada risks compromising its democratic principles, security alliances, and global reputation. But perhaps the most dangerous illusion is believing that doing nothing, attempting to stay neutral, is still a viable strategy. In this new order, hesitation itself is punished. Countries that try to stand in the middle aren't left alone. They're faced with intensified pressure until they are forced to make difficult economic choices. Canada's challenge isn't just about surviving today's tariffs or tomorrow's diplomatic tensions. It's about redefining what sovereignty means in a world where powerful nations influence terms through economic pressure. Can Canada develop a strategy that protects its autonomy without provoking retaliation? Can it build alliances beyond the US-China axis strong enough to withstand external pressure? In the end, the real question isn't about trade. It's about survival in a world where power dictates partnership and where silence, neutrality, or hesitation are seen not as diplomacy, but as weakness to be exploited. Canada once believed that diplomacy, trade agreements, and neutrality could shield it from great power conflicts. Drop a comment for breaking news.